11:03 p.m. I think I've done something I shouldn't have, the voice trembled softly into the recorder. The speaker, Evelyn Clarke, sat alone in her small apartment, the glow of her laptop casting pale shadows across the walls. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the subtle ticking of the clock, suddenly felt louder, sharper, like witnesses waiting for her to continue. Evelyn was ordinary in every sense. 32, accountant, quiet, reliable, the kind of person neighbors barely noticed beyond polite nods in the hallway. There was nothing in her life that hinted at guilt or secrecy. No criminal record. No public scandals. And yet, here she was, speaking into a microphone, words trembling past her lips, as if the act of confession itself carried a weight too heavy to bear. "I don't know how this will sound," she whispered. I never meant for anyone to hear this." Her hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that the skin on her knuckles shone pale in the dim light. She paused, swallowed, and the recorder captured her hesitation, a subtle intake of breath, followed by silence that stretched unnaturally. The first part of her confession was careful, fragmented. She admitted to minor betrayals, small lies at work, withholding the truth from friends, minor betrayals no one would expect to cause serious harm. But there was an underlying tension, something unspoken in her tone. Listeners, or anyone who might stumble upon the recording, could sense the weight behind the words. Something bigger hid beneath the surface. And then came the subtle sounds in the room, initially dismissed as ordinary. The faint scratch of a chair leg against the hardwood floor, a soft creak from the bedroom door, a whisper of movement behind her. Evelyn did not comment, but the microphone picked up the shifts, the micropauses, the irregular rhythm. The environment itself seemed alive, pressing in on her, amplifying her anxiety. She spoke again. I didn't plan it. It happened. And now," her voice trailed off, a shiver threading through the recording. Then, almost imperceptibly, a second sound, a soft click, like a lock being undone somewhere she hadn't been. Evelyn flinched, but there was no one visible. She pressed forward, continuing her confession, unaware that every word, every pause, was being documented, not just for herself, but for anyone who might stumble upon it later. By 11:15 p.m., Evelyn had fully revealed her secret, at least the portion she could articulate without breaking down. She recounted an incident at work, a decision that had consequences she could not undo. She admitted small betrayals that hinted at something far larger, the edges of a moral misstep that could spiral out of control. And yet, she never explained everything, never revealed the full truth. That part was unspoken, buried between breaths, hidden in hesitation, in the clicks and scrapes the room produced around her. Evelyn stopped, stared at the laptop screen, and whispered, almost to herself, "I hope no one ever hears this." But in that quiet, the unnoticed sounds in the apartment paused. A subtle shift, a stillness that was heavier than silence. Something, or someone, was present. And although no eyes met hers, the tension in the room was unmistakable, a subtle reminder that a confession meant to remain private could already be compromised. As the night stretched on, Evelyn saved the recording, closed her laptop, and turned off the lights. She walked to her bedroom, unaware that the recording had captured not only her words but the unspoken presence in the room, a detail that would later unravel everything she thought she could control. The audience is left with one chilling thought. The confession had begun, but it was never truly hers to keep. By the next morning, Evelyn's carefully recorded confession was no longer hers alone. The small apartment had no signs of intrusion, no indication that anyone had listened in physically, but the file, stored on her cloud account, had been accessed. Not by her. Not yet. At 8:14 a.m., her co-worker, Daniel Torres, noticed the recording while performing routine system maintenance. His face went pale as he listened to the first words. Evelyn's voice, ordinary in tone yet trembling with restrained panic, spoke of decisions and betrayals that nobody outside her apartment should have known. He paused, rewound, played again. The faint background noises, the scratch of the chair, the soft click of the bedroom door, became more apparent, more unnerving. He couldn't tell if the sounds were mechanical, accidental, or deliberate. Daniel had worked with Evelyn for nearly 5 years. She was meticulous, responsible, and quiet. Nothing about her suggested danger or wrongdoing. And yet, in that recording, the weight behind every word told a different story. Meanwhile, Evelyn, completely unaware of the breach, went through her morning routine. She made coffee, brushed her hair, checked emails, any ordinary activity, but the knowledge that she had spoken a confession that wasn't meant to exist outside her walls had begun to cast a shadow over her actions, even in hindsight. At the office, the audio had been shared, quietly, with Maya Collins, a junior auditor who had stumbled across it on Daniel's screen. Her reaction was one of disbelief, then quiet panic. Maya didn't know whether to confront Evelyn, alert management, or keep it to herself. The background noises became a fixation. That faint click and subtle scrape seemed intentional now, like a signal, a warning, or perhaps a witness to something unseen. Investigators weren't involved yet, but inconsistencies began to emerge immediately. The timeline of Evelyn's confession didn't match minor entries in her calendar. Meetings she claimed she had attended, emails she had supposedly sent. It was as if parts of her life had been overwritten or erased. Daniel and Maya speculated in whispers. Had she planned to hide this confession? Or had someone else been monitoring her? As the day stretched on, Evelyn's small apartment remained silent, but for the recording, nothing else betrayed a presence. And yet, Daniel noticed something chilling. The background noises seemed to shift subtly depending on which speaker he used to play the file. On his laptop, the click came after a pause. On the office speakers, it seemed to precede a phrase. Small, imperceptible differences, but enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. By evening, rumors had started to circulate at work. Evelyn had said things in private that didn't match her public persona. Friends received cryptic messages from her phone that she didn't send. The confession had already begun to ripple, yet Evelyn remained oblivious to the reach of her own words. And then came the first unsettling confrontation. Evelyn returned home late that night to find her apartment exactly as she had left it, but on her laptop, a cursor blinked in the recording file. The playhead had been moved. Someone, or something, had listened further than she had intended. She hadn't touched the machine. She hadn't shared the password. And yet, the confession had escaped her control. As she sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp, Evelyn realized the subtle sound she had ignored, the faint scrape, the soft click, the pauses in the background, were no longer trivial. They had witnessed the betrayal of her privacy, capturing not just her guilt, but a presence she could neither see nor fully understand. The audience is left with an uneasy truth. The confession had spread, the noises had been noticed, and the meaning of each word, each pause, was already being misinterpreted, manipulated, and questioned, long before anyone could confront Evelyn herself. The story was no longer confined to her apartment. And as the recording continued to circulate quietly, almost imperceptibly, a question lingered. Had the confession ever truly been hers to keep, or had it been waiting to be heard all along? Days had passed since the recording began circulating quietly. Evelyn, unaware of the growing audience, went about her life with mounting unease. Something about the way she moved through her apartment felt different. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the refrigerator now echoed like a silent accusation. Meanwhile, Daniel and Maya had begun dissecting the recording more systematically. They noted subtle patterns in the background noises, scrapes and clicks that hadn't seemed significant at first. Pauses in Evelyn's speech coincided with these sounds, almost as if she was reacting to something unseen. It wasn't just coincidence. Audio experts brought in later would describe these anomalies as deliberate, rhythmic, and contextual, though no one could prove what they meant. Some suggested a mechanical source, a chair, a window, the building itself. Others argued for human intervention, someone moving deliberately in the apartment while Evelyn recorded. But no evidence of intrusion existed. The more Daniel and Maya analyzed, the more contradictions appeared. Evelyn's recollection of events, her diary entries, calendar notes, and emails did not match the timeline of the recording. Certain entries had been deleted or altered. Messages she supposedly sent to friends at specific hours had vanished. Even the cloud logs showed signs of access at times she had been away. And then there was Evelyn herself. Digging through old journals, Daniel discovered passages that suggested a private struggle she had never spoken of, anxiety, paranoia, and fears of someone discovering her secrets. These fears had not been grounded in reality, or so it seemed. Yet the recording suggested that someone had been listening, or that something had been noticed she didn't intend to be noticed. A new player emerged in the investigation, Theo Mercer, a neighbor who had previously been overlooked. He claimed to have seen Evelyn late at night, pacing near the window, whispering to herself. His statements were inconsistent. Sometimes she seemed frantic, other times calm, but he insisted she had spoken lines that matched the confession even before the recording existed online. Multiple interpretations arose. Self-induced paranoia. Evelyn's own anxiety had created the perception of a presence in the room. Covert surveillance. Someone had accessed her apartment or cloud files, monitoring her behavior. A moral experiment. Perhaps she had unconsciously crafted the confession to be discovered, testing boundaries she could never face in public. Each explanation was plausible, and each was terrifying in its own way. No one could confirm which, if any, was correct. The deeper Daniel and Maya dug, the more they realized that the confession itself had layers Evelyn had never intended to reveal. Words spoken hesitantly in her apartment carried meanings she hadn't consciously considered, hints of mistakes, betrayals, and moral compromises that expanded in significance once overheard. The unseen presence, the scrape, the click, the pause, added weight to every sentence, as though the room itself had become a silent auditor. By the end of the week, the investigation had reached a crossroads. Evelyn remained oblivious to the growing scrutiny. Daniel and Maya had compiled notes, timelines, and audio analyses, but no single narrative fit the facts. The confession had been heard. The noises had been documented. Yet the truth remained slippery, elusive, and morally ambiguous. The audience is left with an unsettling realization. The confession was never just words spoken in private. It was a trap, a test, or perhaps a warning, layered with intention and ambiguity. And in the shadows of the apartment, the subtle noises, the scrape of a chair, the soft click of a door, the faint whisper of movement, remained, a haunting reminder that some truths are never fully known, only interpreted. Weeks had passed since the confession first leaked. Evelyn moved through her apartment with a quiet, tense precision, checking locks, double-checking the laptop, and avoiding shadows that now seemed to linger longer than they should. She never discovered who had listened to her words, or why, and the uncertainty weighed heavier than any revelation could. Daniel and Maya had presented their findings to authorities, but without physical evidence, the case was classified as unresolved. Audio anomalies, timeline inconsistencies, and the odd access logs were noted, but the official stance was that no crime had occurred. The authorities closed the files, and yet everyone involved, the listeners, the analysts, the neighbors, felt the invisible tension in Evelyn's words, the gaps in her story, and the subtle but undeniable presence that had always existed in the room. Even those closest to Evelyn noticed a change. She became quieter, more withdrawn, her glances sharper and more deliberate. Friends noticed her avoiding certain topics, leaving conversations abruptly, and sometimes staring at walls as though listening for sounds others couldn't hear. The background noises recorded in her confession, the faint scrape of a chair, the soft click of the bedroom door, the pause between breaths, had become emblems of a larger truth that could never be confirmed. Multiple theories circulated, each plausible and disturbing. Someone had been surveilling Evelyn, manipulating the situation to force the confession into the open. Evelyn had subconsciously engineered the confession, a psychological act of self-exposure that only she fully understood. The noises were entirely coincidental, artifacts of the apartment's creaks and hums, but perceived through the lens of guilt and fear, they became sinister. A third party may have influenced both the confession and the background sounds, remaining completely hidden, their motives unknowable. No evidence could confirm any theory. And in truth, the exact meaning of the confession, the intent, the guilt, the secrecy, remained forever obscured by human interpretation and the limits of perception. Evelyn continued her life, but the apartment never felt empty again. Every sound, no matter how ordinary, carried the weight of suspicion. Even the recording itself, now archived and circulated privately among a few analysts, retained its unnerving power. Those who heard it could not decide whether they had uncovered a moral failing, a crime, or simply a private human confession twisted by circumstance. And yet, perhaps the most haunting aspect was this. Even if someone had truly listened, even if a presence had been there, the confession's full meaning would never be known. Words, intention, and sound had merged into an event that could never be perfectly reconstructed. Evelyn sometimes whispered to herself late at night, "I hope no one ever hears this again." But the recording existed. The sounds existed. The truth, as it had been spoken, as it had been accidentally or deliberately overheard, would linger in ambiguity forever. In the end, the apartment remained ordinary. The walls, the chair, the door, they seemed the same. But those who knew the story, those who heard the confession and the background noises, understood the chilling reality. Some words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. Some confessions, once heard, cannot be forgotten. And the audience is left with a final thought. The confession may have been heard, but the truth was never meant to be understood, and perhaps never will be.